All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, if you've just joined us, my name's Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. I'm very happy today to be joined by Sean Olson, one of our partners from ZenSecured. So I'm going to have Sean introduce himself and ZenSecured when we switch over to his portion of today's session. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before I get started in the formal presentation, just a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. That does include Q&A. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation. However, you can submit questions via the chat feature. I'll be monitoring that as Sean speaks to answer those questions that come up over that channel. We also had a number of questions submitted when people registered. So if you submitted those, we're going to be answering those at the end of today's session. If for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can do that in a couple of different ways. You can just try and refresh your screen, or you can go back to the email you received, click on that link there, and reconnect via that link. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our CMMC experts, or if you have any additional questions about Exostar or our solutions, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a question form there on every page, and so you can submit your questions that way as well. So with that, let's dive into the presentation. So this is the agenda we're going to cover today. You're going to first hear from me about the current state of CMMC. I'm then going to transition over to Sean, and that's where he's going to cover the bulk of today's presentation. So where are we in kind of the CMMC timeline? Well, exciting news last week, right? The final CFR, the Code of Federal Regulation, sorry about that, was published in the Federal Registry. That was 48 CFR. Those two CFRs that went into place, 32 that went into effect last year on 12/16 of 2024, that was the rule that established the CMMC program. It defined it, it defined terminology around it, it said where the standards were, where you could find them, etc. So that kind of laid out the framework for it. So since then, organizations have been able to apply for and have C3PAOs come out and do their attestation and affirmation of their compliance. What just dropped or was just published was the Title 48 CFR. What that does is allow the DoD to start to submit that language into their contracts to include CMMC in those DoD contracts. Now, the major difference between what's going to be in effect and what is currently in effect is that CMMC moves the requirement to have both self-attestation for those who don't use controlled unclassified information to fulfill their contracts, but tightens up those requirements for those that do to require certified third-party assessments of your compliance with NIST 800-171. It also defines some terms that have been in the industry for quite a while, but kind of puts them in terms of the CMMC program. One of those is for cloud service providers. These are folks who, like Exostar, who provide services to store, process, and transmit controlled unclassified information. In those cases, those service providers must be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. It also defined external service providers. These are often those MSPs or MSSPs, those managed service providers or those managed security service providers that you may work with to fulfill part of your IT organization function. Those folks are are considered part of your overall CMMC controls, and so they're going to be assessed as part of your overall assessment of your level 2 or level 3, kind of depending where you're going or which of the programs you're trying for. Just to level set everybody about CMMC, it breaks it up into these 3 levels. Level 1 is the majority of the organizations out there. You are folks who only get federal contract information, or FCI. If you're one of those organizations, there are 15 requirements that you need to meet to secure that information. You need to do an annual self-assessment and annually affirm that you do those things. If you receive controlled unclassified information, then you start to fall into that level 2 or level 3 category. Level 2, there are 2 different types of level 2 requirements. There is one for a small number of organizations that are still going to allow you to do a self-assessment and an annual affirmation that you do those NIST 800-171 controls. Those are those 110 controls that you have in place to ensure that you comply with those to secure that controlled unclassified information. Now, the majority of you who are level 2 are going to be required to have that third-party assessor come out and do a once every 3-year assessment that you are in compliance with those 110 controls. Level 3, small portion of the organizations out there, you're also going to be required to do a once every 3-year assessment, but that assessment is going to be done by DFARS. That's the organization within the DoD that monitors compliance for the defense industrial base. Now, the program itself is going to be implemented over a 3-year time frame. This first year, right, so starting in November, that's when the CMMC rule take effect, right? It was 60 days after the implementation of 48 CFR. That Title 48, since it was done last week on September 10th, the requirements can start to appear as soon as November 10th in the contracts. But as you see, there's a phased-in period. That initial phase is a 1-year period where it's expected that level 1 and level 2 are both be self-assessments. After that initial 12-month period, that's when you'll start to see that level 2 certification be required. And then in phase 3, you'll start to see that level 3 certification be required. And after those first 3 years, there'll be a full implementation. Now, please take into account that blue box at the bottom of this. This is that fact that the DoD can, for certain contracts, start to implement CMMC requirements earlier than this phased approach. So it will be on a contract by contract basis. Now, there are requirements today that you may have in place because you're already under contract to the DoD or you're a subcontractor to somebody that is. In that case, you'll have DFARS clauses, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations clauses, that require you to meet really these same requirements, because these are also wrapped around NIST 800-171, that if you receive controlled unclassified information, you're in compliance with NIST 800-171. That's that 7012 clause. If you've got a contract that has the 7019 clause in it, you're required to do a self-assessment of your compliance with NIST 800-171. So you basically go in and score yourself against each of those 110 controls. That scoring system is laid out in NIST 800-171A. That's the assessment guide. And there's a point score for each of the different controls. Those points are a 5, a 3, or a 1, or the negative of those. And so your score is going to range somewhere from a negative 203 to a positive 110. You then take that value and you enter it into the SPRS system, the Supplier Performance Risk System. And that lets the DoD kind of know where you are in accordance with NIST 800-171, and they use that as part of their overall supplier performance when they're awarding contracts. So there are requirements today. These will all help you get ready for CMMC if you haven't done anything. Doing that initial assessment as part of 7019 should tell you kind of where you stand today and what you need to finish up to be compliant and have that third party come out and do your assessment. So that kind of tells you where we are today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean from our partner ZenSecured to really get down to the meat of today's presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, everyone, for showing up today. As Kevin alluded to here, I'm going to go ahead and share my copy of the slides here so I can show and control my angle of this. Hopefully, everybody can see that.
We can.
All right. So, like I said, hello, everyone. My name is Sean. I work for ZenSecured. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer at ZenSecured. We are a consulting firm in the DIB space. We are members of the CMMC ecosystem officially. I am a CMMC certified professional, CCP, and I'm also a lead CMMC certified assessor. So I'm official inside the CyberAB ecosystem, okay? And we're going to talk today about managing your flow down requirements across the supply chain. So this is one of the subjects that I love the most. That's why I decided to participate in this particular Exostar webinar with Kevin today. I love to talk about this one, and I feel like it's misunderstood or not well understood throughout the DIB. And so hopefully I'll bring you some clarity today on how this works, and then also toward the end give you some practical advice on how you can manage it in your organization should you be subject to it. So let's start off about where we are today. So I'm going to kind of jump off of what Kevin had said earlier about the CMMC program. But I'm also going to say to you, this actually started earlier, right? So Kevin mentioned some of the DFARS clauses. He included this DFARS 252.204-7012. This is really where it all began for most DIB contractors. This is the clause that says, hey, there's this thing called covered defense information, and I'll get into the difference between that and CUI and CTI and all that here in a moment. This is the clause in contracts created for the DoD where they can impose requirements for how CUI, CDI, et cetera, are handled. And these do include flow down requirements, which I'm going to talk about here momentarily. Now, most people may not know that the 15 requirements from the CMMC level 1 are also required through another FAR clause, or an actual FAR clause. So the FAR is the federal level, right? And then the DFARS is the defense supplement to the FAR for matters that are important to the Defense Department in and above what's required for the FAR. So the FAR says FAR 52.204-21, that's where the FCI clause is that represents CMMC level 1. A lot of folks don't know that that too has a flow down. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment. And then there are a couple of additional clauses here. There's DFARS. I'm just going to say DFARS 7012, DFARS 7020, just to cut the numbers short there because we don't have a lot of time today, and I don't really like saying the numbers. So DFARS 7020, these are the DoD assessment requirements. You may also have these in your contract. It includes a flow down as well. Interestingly, though, DFARS 7019, which Kevin spoke about earlier as well, is the Notice of Assessment Requirements and the SPRS system. This one does not have a flow down, but as you'll see, that kind of doesn't matter for the most part because what's implied by that is also implied by some of these other requirements here. What's important to know is that these requirements, these contract clauses that the DoD will put in contracts for CUI, FCI, et cetera, do have flow downs that need to be spread across the procurement side of things, just depending on the situation, and we'll talk about that. So let's take a closer look at DFARS 7012, our granddaddy here. This is a flow down requirement as well. So the clause says you're going to do certain things. You're going to follow 800-171, Rev 2 in our case, and that's still the case for the immediate future, although Rev 3 is coming up. You're going to implement those requirements. They're called requirements now The DoD changed the language on that. They're not practices or controls anymore. They call them requirements. But you're also going to do certain other things, which I'll talk about in a minute. The important bit here is what it says about flow downs. This particular contract clause, DFARS 7012, I've highlighted 3 areas of the flow down piece here that's important to know if you're not already familiar with this. What they're saying here at paragraph M and its pieces is that you will include this in subcontracts. So let's say you're a prime or a subcontractor somewhere in this supply chain who's receiving this. You are then, of course, in turn going to require this in your contracts that you have with your subs below you, downstream from you, if they're going to be dealing with CDI as well. So include this clause, including this paragraph M in subcontracts. In a subcontract, if the subcontract performance will involve covered defense information. Again, I'll get into that in a minute. But the contractor shall determine when this clause is necessary, if there's CDI, etc. So it's on the subcontractor to decide whether or not this should flow down to their subcontractors. Okay, those are the important pieces to remember of this particular clause, and similar language in some of the other clauses as well. So just a moment here, just to talk about CDI versus CTI versus CUI and on and on. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to consider them equivalent, although they're not. Technically, they are different things. Ultimately, they all point in the same direction. They all really mean, at the end of the day, the same thing. COI, Controlled Unclassified Information, is a program that was established by an executive order under the Obama administration back in 2011. We're going back quite a bit on that one. This is where the COI category was created of data, Controlled Unclassified Information, so not secret, not top secret, not anything like that. Then there's CDI, and the reason why CDI, or at least one of the reasons why CDI was created as a concept or as a data type, is because the CUI program, even to this day, is still not fully in effect. The FARS CUI rule, some of you might be familiar with this, has yet to be released, has yet to be published in the CFRs. So some agencies within the federal government have taken upon themselves to create stand-ins. And that's part of the reason why CDI as a concept exists. They said, well, we're going to have this blanket term that probably means CTI and perhaps some other potential CUI categories. And so they call it CDI in DFARS 7012, for example. There is a 32 CFR Part 236 that kind of explains what happens here, right? For practical purposes, CTI and other defense CUI information are CUI. They're equivalent in terms of how they're to be handled. And CTI, of course, we're getting back to what most of the folks in the supply chain do for the federal government, which is controlled technical information. Okay, but for the purposes of our discussion, like I said, let's consider all of these to be pointing at the same basic idea. Although there are nuances, they are functionally equivalent for this discussion. So let's talk about flow down basics here. If you're already a supply chain guru out there and you know everything there is to know about contracting with the federal government, specifically the DoD, then this might be old news for you. But hang on, because we're going to talk about some practical stuff toward the end of this, some things that maybe you hadn't thought of that might help you with your supply chain management journey. So let's start at the top here. We have in the green, we have the FAR and DFARS clauses that are put into DoD contracts. The DoD says we're going to require these things, and we're going to call these out in these FAR and DFARS clauses. So they release these contracts out, and a prime picks it up. A prime is always the first one in the chain, the first link in the chain of any DoD contract. That's the prime contractor. The prime receives their FAR and DFARS requirements as part of the contract. You know, the thing about these contracts that's funny is that sometimes when you receive them, they're just lists of DFARS and FAR clauses, which is, a little bit difficult sometimes to deal with. This is essentially the fine print, right, that the DoD puts into its contracts. At the top of the contract, you'll have information about, the deliverables that you need to do and what the contract specifies are requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But then you read down, usually toward the bottom, these clauses exist, FAR and DFARS, and unfortunately, most of the time, maybe some of the time they don't spell these out, or they don't blow out the full textual language of the FAR and DFARS clauses. It's kind of up to the prime and the subcontractors to figure out what those things are, read them, make sure they understand them, and know how they apply, right? And so anyway, they'll get these contracts with FAR and DFARS clauses, and they'll have to decide which of their subcontractors, if there are, that these apply to and which ones to flow down to. As you can see here, the flow down really works just like the metaphor suggests. We're pushing this down to each contractor in the chain where those requirements apply. In the case of DFARS 7012 and the CMMC stuff, we're talking about CUI, FCI, etc. So if we're sharing FCI, or we have a contractor that's generating for us on behalf of the government, they're part of that chain where these requirements apply. Okay. But what's important also to know about this, now that we have the basics here, is that the compliance part of this flows in the other direction. What do I mean by that? In supply chains for DoD contracts with these FARs and DFARS clauses that require us to do things, especially for cybersecurity compliance, for example, the lower tiers must be compliant before the upper tiers can be considered compliant. So just as an aside here, that's the reason why if you work for a prime, if your organization is a sub for a prime, you've already received the message that you need to, get up to snuff in terms of your compliance, right? Well in advance of the CMMC program being implemented even. So that's why, because they can't be compliant until you are, if you're in their chain. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. Here's an example for CMMC. Note the subcontractor at the lowest tier, so the far bottom right of this little diagram that I have here. That subcontractor needs to be compliant before the next contractor in the upward flow, the upstream, can be considered compliant if you're part of their chain. And then that continues on up the chain until everybody is compliant. Then the prime can be considered compliant. Okay, so it's this reverse order of events here need to happen. I can't be compliant until my subs are compliant. Right? That's an interesting situation to be in, and is a cause for a lot of headaches for a lot of suppliers. And part of the reason why we're having this discussion today is figure out what we can do about that. As I said before, this explains why suppliers at the top end have been very aggressive about trying to get their subs to get in compliance. So what does DFARS 7012, for example, say must flow down? What are the actual requirements that are flowing down? We know about the 110 NIST SP 800 171 requirements, or controls, if you prefer. We know about those. We know we have to implement those, and we may have to certify that we've implemented those as well. But DFARS goes further than that. DFARS 7012 goes further. It says subcontractors, whom this applies to, whom have this particular clause in their contracts, must also have the capability to report incidents directly to the DoD Cybercrime Center, or DC3. So that means your subs need to be able to do this. It also means they need to have the capabilities to log into that site to perform that activity, which requires DoD-approved medium assurance certificates. So if you have CACs or PIVs, those will work, but we're also talking about ECAs, or external certification authorities here. There are only a couple of firms that offer these. IdenTrust is one of them. I can't remember the other one off the top of my head. But those folks, you'll have to have at least 2 of those in your subs so that they can log in and report those requirements as well. This is part of the flow down. The subcontractor must also submit any discovered malicious software. So if there was a ransomware event that, for example, that happened at your sub and it impacts, CMMC or DFARS 7012 CUI in some way, then you've got to be able to supply that back to the DoD. Subcontractor must also preserve and protect images of known affected information systems. So forensic images is what we're talking about here. You need to be able to supply that back and say, here are the forensic images of the affected systems in scope for this incident. That capability needs to be there per contract requirement. The subcontractor must provide the DoD with access to additional information or affected equipment, meaning systems, for forensic analysis. It's entirely possible that the DoD might want to come on site. And so that subcontractor would have to be open to that. So these are the things that just that one flow down requirement or set of requirements from DFARS 7012 say must go down. So it's got to go all the way down the chain for any of these subs that are in some way dealing with CUI or FCI. Actually, in this case, just CUI. 7012 is about CUI. So what about CMMC? We've been talking about the CMMC program at the start of this presentation. Well, basically the same rules apply. So even if we're not talking about the older DFARS 7012, CMMC also talks about flow downs. So they're still there. You're probably going to get a 7012 DFARS clause inside your contract anyway, if you're planning on doing anything with CUI or you have that requirement from the DoD. But on top of that are the clauses for CMMC. And so the program says this: prime contractors shall comply and shall require subcontractors to comply with and to flow down CMMC requirements, such that compliance will be required throughout the supply chain at all tiers with the applicable CMMC level 1, 2, or 3, and assessment type, self-assess or certification for each subcontract. This is from 32 CFR, so the earlier one that's already in effect today. This is 32 CFR Part 170, Section 170.23 for your reference. Says it in black and white. So the final rule that Kevin mentioned earlier today, 48 CFR, which is revised 7021, you may have seen this clause, also includes the flow down requirements. It's right there, right? You may have received this 7021 clause, by the way, in the past. And if you have, that was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to go out yet. But you may have seen that. And in a lot of cases, the government and primes and everything have redacted those. But you may have already seen the text of that. You can go and look at it now while it's published. It was published last week, and see, in fact, there is that flow down requirement. And it'll take effect November 10th. Just a couple of months, not even. So subcontractor non-compliance. Just a word about this real quick, because this is something that the DoD fielded. It's actually in the text of the 48 CFR that just came out last week. This is what they say to questions. Interesting thing is that for 32 CFR Part 170 and the new 48 CFR, they include a giant preamble of rationale, reasons, supplier comments, comments from the industry, etc. They spend an awful lot of time rationalizing their decisions on this before they even get to the text of the rule, right? So in one of the parts of the preamble for this latest one, the question came from contractors saying, hey, am I really responsible for what happens downflow? Can't you be responsible? Can't you be the one to apply the pressure and get those guys in line for us? And DoD's answer was pretty blunt, and it makes sense, unfortunately, if you think about it. They say the government does not establish the relationship between prime contractor and its subcontractors and anywhere down the flow, nor does it indemnify the prime contractor from its subcontractors. The DoD is saying there, in essence, is that you, prime, are responsible for the condition of your, or making sure that your supply chain is doing what they're supposed to according to the requirements. Okay, so the DoD has no part to play in that. So that brings up some interesting, difficult paradigms for us. If we have a sub, for example, that's not up to snuff, or they fall out of compliance or whatever it is, we have to really seriously consider whether we're going to continue to do business with them. Always good to have backups. So given the gravity of this, what do we do? These flow downs necessitate practical steps, immediate steps to ensure subcontractor compliance, things that we do on the upstream to ensure that the downstream is where it needs to be for us, because it's a risk for us if it's not. All organizations at all tiers of the contracting and subcontracting relationship, that whole stream, will need to ensure a few things about their own downstream suppliers. I said supplies there, that is a typo. So if a subcontractor is doing things with FCI or CUI, we have those flow downs. Those have to go down. And generally speaking, it is the exact content of the clause that we received from the upstream. In one of them, I believe it says the substance of the clause. Might as well just include the clause because that is really what's implied there. Subcontractors will need to implement all the requirements that will flow down to them. That includes, if they're level 1, those 15 requirements, or if it's the 52 204-21, the FAR clause, and or the 110 CMMC level 2 requirements for CUI, plus all those things that were mentioned in the DFARS 7012 clause in addition. Some contractors will also need to be capable of addressing that DFARS 7012 requirements. I just spoke about that. So you got to have the medium assurance certificates, for example. In case there's an incident, you need to be able to report it, you need to be able to log into that securely, etc. So let me ask you a question. Members of the DoD supply chain, you're facing this dilemma here where you need to make sure your subs are in line and doing their requirements and following all the contractual obligations. Do you have in your organization a supply chain management plan or program? Might be also called a supply chain risk management plan or something like that, whatever it is. If yes, if you have something like that today, if you're lucky enough to be a big enough organization where you can have an arm that does this, then it should be a simple matter of just including this into what you're already doing for that. Okay, so it's another piece of that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. If you're a shop that does ISO 9000X, you do ISO 9000, or if you are in the aerospace industry, Kevin said probably most of you were, then you probably have an AS 9100 program in place today. The same idea here, you're likely to have a QMS. Part of that QMS is going to be supply chain management, one would hope. It is a requirement. And so the idea here is that through your QMS and your supply chain management program you already have in place, you just need to make sure you're tracking these requirements and also the condition of your subs. And it's probably a very good idea to try to diversify your portfolio of subs if you have some that you feel might be at risk. You don't have a formal SCMP currently? Okay, well, it's time to mock one up, something similar, something very low impact if you can. Just need to put something together so that you can track and manage those suppliers according to the requirements. I'm going to give you a flow chart here of something that I work with. I developed this for myself and for other people that we consult with, etc. This is just a generic one. This doesn't have any kind of secret information or anything in there. This is a busy slide, however, I realize that, but this is just to give you an idea of the sort of chain of events that happen and also the gating factors in here for managing your supply chain. If a supplier doesn't do this well, then we've got to go back to this other part of the flow, for example. But let's focus on the bottom left here. So you see at the bottom left, those 4 boxes there, we're going to talk about actually planning and preparing and then selecting your suppliers. This is where this should happen. For some folks, it's going to be a little too late. We can talk about that. But let's focus on those 4 boxes. So phase 1, the plan and prep phase. What we want to do here in a good supply chain management plan is establish our selection criteria. How are we going to determine what suppliers we're going to use for what functions? Hopefully you have something like this in place today. Maybe not formal, but hopefully you have some function in your organization for how you select your procurements, how you select your suppliers in the supply chain. What we need to do here is establish criteria that says something to the effect of, we need you to be able to be DFARS 7012 compliant. We need you to be able to be CMMC either certified or have done the self-assessment, et cetera, right? So we need to have this codified somewhere so that the people who are helping us in our supply chain and our organization might be a procurement lead or something like that, so that they have some criteria that they can establish with suppliers and be able to decide which ones to go with and which ones not. So you see I have the red box there for that. And then I have, or the red circle there for that. And then I have another red circle on the receive and evaluate proposals against the criteria. Here we are. Does this supplier meet the requirements that we've set out in the selection criteria? Are they able to do that? Are they already certified? Now, rather than, if you don't have a supply chain management plan in place today, rather than going through some formal diagram like what I've got here, you at least want to cover these two bases and some additional bases. We'll cover that in a moment. What's left to manage after you've selected a supplier you feel is, worth the risk, and they've said they can do these things, you verified, you validated, you've selected them. You still have more to manage when it comes to those suppliers. It's possible that a supplier might lose its certification, for example, or it's possible that they're just not able to meet the obligations for cybersecurity, the DFARS and FARS stuff, for example. So it's on you. Remember, the DoD said no indemnification. It's on you to make sure that those suppliers in that part of the chain downflow from you are meeting those requirements. So we want to have checks and balances somewhere. We want to be able to look at those suppliers and grade them and say, okay, we can continue to do business with you. I mean, it might come down to that in some cases, because, as long as you're doing these things. Now, of course, there are penalties and remedies for noncompliance, and we'll not cover that topic today. That's quite big. Just know that there are those in place, and so it's up to us to make sure that our supply chain is there. If a supplier falls out of compliance, what must happen? Hard decisions at that point. Hopefully you have a stand-in or something that you can do business with outside of that, some way to accomplish the mission without that supplier, because you might have to drop them, at least temporarily, until they can get back into the compliance state. So alternates are always a good idea. We should do that anyway. A good QMS recommends that we do that. But, it may not be worth the risk to continue with any particular supplier, and that is a real decision that may have to be made in your organization. So it's really important that we take these extra steps here to make sure we're managing that supply chain. A lot of folks don't think about that part, right? Well, they're compliant now, they got their certification, but that's just a moment in time. Over time, things may change. We need to be able to track that. So you may demand evidence of compliance status. Now, theoretically, they're not obligated to provide you with their certificate of compliance, for example, that comes as a result of a C3PAO certification. But, you can say, hey, look, we really need evidence here that you are towing the line, right? That you're there. For level 1, because it's a self-attestation, and they have the requirement to input that information into the supplier performance risk system, SPRS for short. Then, of course, you can always inquire about that, and they can provide that evidence as needed. For level 2, there's that certificate of certification that they would be, that would be given to them at the end of a successful certification. But if they're doing self-assessment, there are SPRS activities, again, that need to be done there, so you can ask for that. Now, again, they're not obligated to give you the SPRS information directly, but if they're on your side and they want to do business with you, I think there's enough pressure there for them to provide some evidence of that. Level 3 suppliers are a whole different matter. So there's getting this level 2 certification first. That's the case in every case where there's a level 3 requirement on a supplier, which would have come from the top, by the way. They first have to receive a level 2 certification. So they've got to go through the C3PAO process and get that cert. And then they obtain from the DoD, and Kevin spoke about this earlier, that level 3 portion, which is the delta between level 2 and level 3. Now, DIBCAC is a function of the government. It's part of DCMA, Defense Contracting Management Agency. So it's a group of folks within there who do the assessments of their contractors on behalf of the government. And it's no charge. I think that there are certainly some expenses related to that, but it's nothing like the charge that's going to be required by a C3PAO. They're supposed to be basically at no cost. It's all funded by taxpayer dollars. So you don't have a supply chain management program in place today, right? Most of you probably do. There might be some of you, especially in smaller shops, that don't. So what can we do about that? Find people who are go-getters. If you're a small shop, it's likely that you have people in your organization who are rock star performers. You might have a program manager or project manager or a few. You may have that kind of function in your organization. Try and see if you can leverage those people to help you out, because rock stars in program management can make mountains move. I know some of you know that already. I've been in that position before CMMC was a thing, before the particular org that I was working for was doing defense contracts. I was program managing and then continued that role when we got defense contracts and continued along that and became an expert pretty quickly. So that's my recommendation for you. If you don't have supply chain management, you don't have a function in your organization for supply chain management, is you might have to find some rock stars. Bring one in from external. That's always a good idea. And of course, you can work with consultants to do that. I'm going to give some more tips for success here, just as our last slide, and this might be the most important takeaway, at least for my part of the presentation here. Spend the time first and foremost to understand where FCI and CUI flow in the scope of what you're doing for the DoD. Whether they're a prime, subcontractor, whatever. It's very important. Number one, it's a requirement for CMMC Level 2 that you have a system security plan, SSP, that includes architectural and data flow diagrams that describes the system's functions, right? So if you have CMMC Level 2, this is something you already have to do. So my advice to you is to do this early. The clock is ticking now, right? Because we've got 2 months before our phase 1 starts. But do this early. Try to find out in your organization where that stuff goes. That data is really the fundamental principle of the purpose of CMMC and DFARS 7012 for that matter. Where's that data? And does it make sense to have that data in certain places, et cetera? Now, once you understand where that data is in your organization, and maybe you need to hire an expert from outside the organization to give you a hand. We're all busy. We all wear multiple hats. That's totally fine. But if it's in places where it shouldn't be, CUI in particular, that could constitute spillage, and that's a bad deal for everybody. That's a reportable situation, and so we want to make sure that we're not having a spillage issue. The CUI should be contained where it can be protected according to the requirements. So this gets to the biggest little lesson here, and that is reduce your scope as much as possible. My colleagues and I in the CMMC ecosystem talk about this all the time, and it seems to be something that's hard for folks to get their head around. This is extremely important. You need to be able to reduce the data footprint of the business that you're doing for the federal government, the DoD in this case. So if you want to create an enclave, that is a great idea because you don't want that data to be extended out. We're talking about access control, right? Access control to that data. It shouldn't go here. It shouldn't be seen by these people, et cetera, in your organization. An enclave solution is a great idea. Exostar, for example, has an enclave type solution that you can leverage if you wanted to. That's a great idea to reduce your scope down to the lowest possible level you can. That may also mean and should mean that you're limiting the suppliers that receive that information. If it's not required for a particular supplier in downflow, the downstream, to receive a certain kind of information, or you can, use other kinds of information that's not requiring that protection instead, do that and reduce the number of suppliers that you have to push these flow downs to. Vitally important. And it can be done. I have seen organizations reduce their footprint considerably by going through this scoping exercise. And they know where the data is, they know who they're flowing it to, and now they can condense this and bring it back and reduce that flow, that footprint. That is extremely important. That will save you a lot of time and money if you do that right. Speaking of doing it right, please, for the love of goodness, find consultants and people out there who are part of the ecosystem. One of the things, this is just an anecdote I'll bring up, but again, I talk with people in the CMMC ecosystem all the time, my compatriots, right? And we talk about what it means to get assistance from people in the ecosystem versus not. One of the things that's come up recently, and this, again, this isn't a hard number, but this is what we've seen as CCAs, especially in C3PAOs. A lot of organizations, 2/3, maybe 3/4, don't make it past phase 1 of the certification process because they're not ready. They might not have gotten great advice, or they might not have gotten any advice. This is not easy stuff to digest. It's complicated. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of things. I learned a lot from going through the CCP and the CCA, and I'm a 20-year veteran of this stuff. So if you need to get assistance, definitely do so. And please try to use someone from the ecosystem. I know it might be a little more expensive, maybe not. Try to do that so that you can get the right advice and be prepared for this. Do it right the first time is the old saying, right? And with that, that concludes my part. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sean. So we're going to bring Sean back in just a minute to answer questions. So let me share out my slides again. There we go. Get back to here. So I'm going to ask my colleague Doe to share out a, whoops, sorry, didn't get it right, to share out a survey for the audience. We'd appreciate your feedback on this survey. It allows us not only know how we did today, but it'll also ask for some ideas for future webinars that you'd like to hear. So we take your feedback seriously. Love to hear from you. So Sean alluded to some part of Exostar CMMC Ready Suite. If you're going through this process, we have a number of different solutions, as well as partner with people like ZenSecured to get you really ready to perform that CMMC assessment. These are SaaS-based applications, our Policy Pro, our certification, and our Managed Microsoft 365 that allow you to create those policies and procedures, manage that overall CMMC program, and reduce that footprint by putting that CUI information in an enclave that's gated, managed, et cetera, by Exostar that implements 85 of those 110 controls from NIST 800-171. And then you can work with Exostar to engage with one of our partners to provide those readiness assessments, mock assessments. Some of these partners are also C3PO. So when you're ready to do that assessment, we can help out there as well. So with that, I'm going to bring up some questions that were submitted prior and ask Sean to give us his answers to these. So Sean, we're going to start with question 1. So how much responsibility do we have for managing CUI within their premises? And I'm assuming this is when we've sent CUI to a partner.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, right? The we in this case is I'm a supplier, and the there in this case is someone downstream from me, right?
Yep.
So the answer is that, you don't have a responsibility for managing their CUI that they receive from you. Your responsibility is in managing that they're doing what they're supposed to be compliant. Okay, so what does compliance mean in that situation? That's what has to be determined. Once CMMC is in effect and in contracts and all that good stuff, then it's going to be the compliance aspect in terms of certification or that self-assessment and SPRS. You need to make sure that they're doing that work, but you're not managing their CUI directly.
Great, thanks. So for number 2, should I push back on what needs to flow down?
Yeah, it's another one of those, who's the I in this, and who's it getting flowed down to, right?
Yeah. So I'm thinking it's a subcontractor, and somebody's trying to flow down DFARS clauses to me.
Right, I'm a subcontractor, and someone on the upstream is pushing it down. Okay, yep. In that case, that depends. What are you contractually obligated to? Did you receive a DFARS, contract clause that was flowed down to you from their contract? If the answer to that is yes, then I'm afraid to say there's not much you're going to be able to push back on. But maybe you can renegotiate your arrangement with them, contractual or whatever, to reduce the footprint, or to, maybe you don't need to be receiving that information from them, and therefore the blowdowns wouldn't apply to you. But if you're contractually obligated, you'll have to go through the steps of becoming non-contractually, remove that obligation.
Thank you. So number 3, can you give an example of FCI? The FAR definition is really broad.
It's extremely broad. Yeah. So for those who may not have heard the definition, just real quick, it's info that's provided by or generated for the Fed under a contract to develop a product or offer a service that is not intended for public release, information that's not intended for public release. Yeah, pretty broad. Okay, so what does that mean? What examples can I give? I can only give you the examples that that the Fed has given. I really can't go beyond that, unfortunately, because you know, this could be anything. But I do have a way to think about it. So let's talk about some examples first. Technical specs, for example, for the product or service that aren't CUI, they don't rate CUI. That's going to be for sure considered federal contract information. If you are bidding or you have a proposal, you know, things that you're doing to try to get that contract, that would be considered FCI in most cases. I would just play it safe and consider that FCI. Schedules related to the delivery of a product or service under contract. So something that lays out a timeline of when you're going to deliver, right? That's more than likely going to be FCI because it indicates when something's going to happen. And then supplier info, so who you're using as suppliers, that's probably privileged information. That's going to be FCI. Internal communications, okay, related to the product or service. Now we're talking about, okay, where do we draw the line here? Anything that may contain information about that product or service, if that can be separated out from other ordinary conversation, that's going to be FCI, right? Financial records, another example that they give for what could be FCI. So these are things that, you know, you don't want to share. They're not intended to be shared publicly,
Right.
but they're not necessarily CUI. They're not so sensitive that they rate CUI. So it's going to fall under that heading. And here's a way to think about it. Is the particular information that you're looking at, can that be used by an adversary as reconnaissance information to potentially do harm to you or the federal government? If the answer is, yeah, I can see how that could be used for that, it's going to be FCI.
Great. Great answer. So on number 4, how can you easily differentiate, and I don't know what CG is, so that one threw me. CUI, ITAR, and DFARS.
I don't know what CG is either.
Yeah.
I've got to be honest with you.
Okay.
That's a failure on my part. If
Mine
that really
too,
means
because the only
something,
one I got was Commanding General, and I'm pretty sure it's not that. So.
oh, I was thinking Coast Guard, which
Oh, there you
okay,
go.
maybe,
There you go.
but
Maybe.
I don't think that's what the questioner was asking there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right, let's set CG aside. And DFARS 2, we've kind of talked about that. DFARS is the regulatory stuff in the CFRs that are specific to the DoD and their requirements for how they do business. That's where we get the clauses in our contracts from the Department of Defense is DFARS. That's the regulatory side of things.
Yep.
So we're left with what's in the middle here, the CUI and the ITAR, right? So here's the basic idea. CUI and ITAR, for those who don't know, is international traffic in arms. We're talking about weaponry and weaponry systems and things related to that here. These have export control requirements. This is a program that's completely separate from CUI. It predates it by quite a bit. ITAR is for export controlled information and how that's to be handled, who it can go to, and that sort of thing. And so if you see something that's marked as export controlled, that's pointing in the direction of being ITAR or EAR, as some people know it, which is another program just like ITAR for munitions and things like that. So if it's got export controlled stated on it in its marking somewhere, probably ITAR at the very least. If it's CUI, similar thing. It should be. Now there's cases where unmarked CUI happens to be flowing around. That's a story for another time. But if it's marked properly, it will say right in it in the markings. Now, if you're a DoD contractor, hopefully you've done your DoD CUI training module. That is requirement as part of all this. Assuming you had, then you would know the CUI markings are very clear. It's marked CUI or spelled out as controlled classified information with a piece of it called CUI, the 3-letter acronym. Yep. That'll be in the markings.
Great. Okay, so We've still got a few questions left, but just want to let you
Okay.
know. So you are going to be receiving this deck, everybody, and I apologize. I should have stated that up front. I did put it in chat just in case. You'll get the deck as well as a copy of today's recording. This has some additional sources of information. So if you have questions, if you'd like to try some Exostar products, etc., again, just some helpful stuff for you. So let's wrap up. We got just a couple minutes left. So how much would it cost to hire a third party to do all this for me? We always get this question, and it's always kind of, it depends, size of the organization, effort, etc. So I don't know if you can do any better than that.
Just a broad swath here, which is whatever you can't do yourself. If you're attempting to do this yourself, what I would recommend, number one, is to get some support in terms of consultation. If you're not sure about certain things, for sure, that'll cost you a little bit of money. And then if you're hiring a third party to complete all of this, well, number one, they probably aren't going to be able to complete all of it for you. But if you're leveraging a service like the Exostar Managed 365, then you'll get quite a bit of that. So it's just the cost of those implementations plus whatever you have to do on your side. As for numbers, man, we're all over the board. I couldn't really tell you.
Understood. So number 6, and I get this question a lot, especially the second part of this, right? It's like, okay, well, we have everything in GCCI, so we're good. So we've set up policies, SSP and POAM, with support of that third party. We're in GCC High.
Okay.
But we're getting some additional pressure to do other stuff, monitoring, reporting, etc. The platform. What do I need? What's the truth about about these additional things that I need to do, like monitoring and logging?
One of the tricky parts about using a solution like GCC High is that only controls what the information is in there. But if you have that information going other places, or you're using a workstation that's logging into this environment that isn't a VDI solution, for example, then there are going to be some additional things that you need to do on site at your organization to meet the rest of these requirements, because you don't get completely out because of this. So there's still some leftover things, and you talked about that a moment ago, Kevin. We can't get you all the way there. So for those things that are not there yet, you will need to also, if they're in scope, right? If there's CUI somewhere implicated there, you will need to do the rest of the requirements for that, which includes the monitoring and logging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually take 7 here. I'll take 7 simply because, so if you're looking for a system security review, if you're looking for somebody who can kind of show where you are, I would, just like Sean mentioned in his slide, I'd look to find out one of those RPOs from the Cyber AB, those registered practicing organizations that are in your industry, like ZenSecured, right? ZenSecured is one of our partners. Work closely with them. They're located in the Pacific Northwest. If you're in that area, they can certainly do these kinds of services for you. And there's a lot of MSPs out there, again, that can do this. But I would look to those that are certified by the Cyber AB. They've got the right credentials. They've got experience in your industry. So that would be my thing. Anything you want to add there, Sean?
Yeah, absolutely. RPs, RPOs, CCP, CCAs, anybody who's part of the ecosystem has gone through that training. They've had this stuff, rigorously pushed into their brain, and they understand it, and they can help you out.
Great. Well, Sean, I want to thank you for helping me out today. Audience, I'd thank you for coming. Thanks so much for your time and attention today. Have a great day and a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.